They say a man in Oppos, home is his castle, but they forget to mention that the HOA is the dragon sitting at the gate, waiting to breathe fire on your lawn if the grass grows an eighth of an inch too high. And for a long time, I was just a guy who wanted to be left alone, a guy who found his sanctuary at the edge of a quiet, shimmering lake at the back of our development, Blackwood Estates. I'd spend my Saturday afternoons out there with nothing but my old graphite rod, a tackle box that smelled like rubber and dried salt, and my golden retriever, Cooper, who's basically a professional at napping in the sun while I wait for a largemouth bass to take an interest in my lure. And it was the only time the world felt quiet, the only time the constant hum of bills and deadlines in life just faded into the background. But that peace didn't end Oppos. Just break. It was shattered by a single white envelope tucked in my mailbox on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, until I opened it and saw the words in quote, "Notice of violation" in quote, stamped in a red that looked like a warning light, followed by a number that made my stomach do a slow, nauseating flip. $3,500. I stood there on my driveway, the sun beating down on the back of my neck, staring at that paper like it was written in a foreign language because according to the HOA board, I had been, in quote, engaging in unauthorized harvesting of community resources, end quote, which is just a fancy, bureaucratic way of saying I was fishing in the lake I'd lived next to for 15 years. A lake that was the primary reason I bought this house in the first place. And I remember laughing out loud, a dry, bitter sound, thinking it had to be a typo or a clerical error, maybe a prank by one of the neighbors who'd had too much wine at the last block party. But as I read the fine print, the signatures of the board members were right there, clear as day, especially the one at the bottom, Evelyn Vance, the board president, a woman who treated our neighborhood like her own personal fiefdom and spent her weekends patrolling the streets in a golf cart with a clipboard, looking for a reason to ruin someone's afternoon. I didn't end Oppos. Pay it. Obviously, I just figured I'd go to the monthly meeting, show them the community handbook, and we'd all have a good laugh about the misunderstanding. So I showed up at the community center that Thursday, wearing a clean shirt and holding my handbook with the end quote, amenities in quote, section highlighted in yellow, feeling confident, almost sorry for whoever had made such a glaring mistake. But when I walked into that room, the air felt different, heavy, and clinical in there. They were the 5 members of the board sitting behind a long mahogany table like a high court, with Evelyn in the center wearing a suit that was the color of a fresh bruise, her eyes tracking me the moment I stepped through the door, and when it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up and said, in quote, "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake regarding this fishing fine because Section 4, Paragraph B of our own bylaws states that all residents in good standing have full access to community water features for recreational use," end quote. And I waited for the nod, the apology, the end quote. "Oh, you're right, our bad," end quote. But instead, Evelyn just leaned forward, her jewelry clinking against the table, and she gave me this smile that didn't end Oppos. Reached her eyes, a smile that felt like a predator watching a rabbit, and she said, end quote, "The board has recently reinterpreted the definition of an Oppos, recreational use, and Oppos, Mr. Miller, and we have decided that fishing disrupts the aesthetic harmony of a shoreline and constitutes a liability risk. Therefore, the fine stands, and it will double every 30 days it remains unpaid," end quote. I felt the blood rush to my face, that hot, prickly heat of pure, unadulterated injustice. And I looked at the other board members. There was Bill, a guy I'd share beers with at a barbecue, and Sarah, whose kids used to play with mine, but they all just looked at their laps or fiddled with their pens, puppets on a string, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't an Oppos. About fishing, and it wasn't Oppos. About, in quote, aesthetic harmony, in quote. It was about the fact that I'd voted against Evelyn's proposal to build a $500,000 clubhouse we didn't into Oppos. Need, and this was her way of reminding me who held the leash in Blackwood Estates. So I walked out of that room without saying another word, but as the door swung shut behind me, the anger didn't end Oppos. Fade. It just crystallized into something cold and sharp, and I knew I wasn't Oppos. Gonna write that check. Not now. Not ever. But I also knew I couldn't in Oppos. Just ignore them, because an HOA can put a lien on your house. They can take your home right out from under you if you don in Oppos. Play their game. So I decided to stop playing their game and start playing mine. I spent the next 3 weeks in a rabbit hole of property records, old survey maps, and county archives, drinking more coffee than water, and surrounding myself with stacks of dusty folders. Because I had a hunch, a tiny, flickering memory of something an old-timer told me when I first moved in, something about how this whole development was built on what used to be a massive dairy farm back in the 50s. And I started digging into the water rights, which are a complicated, messy business in this part of the country, and what I found made me sit back in my chair at 3 in the morning and just stare at my computer screen in total silence. See, the HOA didn't and oppose. T on the lake. They never did. They just had an easement to use the surface water, and that easement was granted by the owner of the surrounding land and the infrastructure that fed it, specifically the old stone and concrete dam about a half-mile up the creek that kept the lake from turning into a muddy puddle. And that land, along with the dam itself, was owned by a holding company that had gone bankrupt 6 months ago, leaving the property in a sort of legal limbo, a forgotten piece of dirt that the HOA had been too arrogant to realize was the only thing keeping their, in quote, aesthetic harmony, in quote, alive. I made a few phone calls, tracked down the trustee handling the liquidation of the company's assets, and I found out they were desperate to get the property off their books because the liability insurance on an old dam is a nightmare, and they were terrified it would fail and they'd be on the hook for the damages. So I did something that my accountant would call, in quote, financial suicide, in quote, but my soul called, in quote, destiny, in quote. I took out a second mortgage, I emptied my rainy day fund, and I bought that piece of land, dam and all, for a price that was surprisingly low because nobody in their right mind wants to own a piece of crumbling infrastructure, except for a man who's been told he can and oppose. Fish in his own backyard. The day the deed was recorded at the county office, I went home, sat on my porch, and waited for the next letter, which arrived 2 days later, and quote, final demand, in quote, with late fees now totaling $4,200, threatening legal action. Within 72 hours, and I just smiled, tucked the deed into a new envelope, and wrote a short, polite cover letter of my own, addressed directly to Evelyn Vance, informing the board that as the new owner of the primary water control structure and the underlying land of the reservoir, I was hereby terminating the temporary water usage agreement due to, in quote, environmental concerns, in quote, and a lack of, in quote, aesthetic cooperation, in quote, from the neighboring parties. The silence from their end lasted exactly 24 hours before the screaming started, and I donned oppose. Mean literal screaming. I mean the screaming of the HOA's lawyer on my voicemail, but I didn't oppose. Pick up. I just walked up at the dam that afternoon with a heavy-duty wrench and a sense of purpose, and I slowly, methodically closed the main sluice gates, effectively cutting off the flow that replenished the lake and diverted the creek back into its original natural bypass. And then I went to the entrance of the neighborhood where the HOA had spent $40,000 on these elaborate, cascading fountains that were the pride of Evelyn's life, and I shut off the secondary line that fed them too. By the third day, the fountains were nothing but dry, salt-stained concrete basins, and the lake began to recede, exposing the muddy, stinking banks, the old tires and sunken branches that the water had hidden for years, and the emerald green lawns of the board members, which were fed by a lake tap irrigation system, began to turn a sickly, crispy shade of brown under the summer sun, and it was like watching a crown lose its jewels one by one. Evelyn showed up at my front door on the 5th day, her golf cart parked crookedly on the curb, her face a shade of red that almost matched her suit from the meeting, and she didn't oppose. Have her clipboard this time. She just had a look of pure, vibrating fury as she demanded. To know what I thought I was doing, accusing me of, in quote, domestic terrorism, in quote, and, in quote, willful destruction of property value, in quote. And I just leaned against the doorframe, sipping a glass of iced tea, and I said, in quote, Evelyn, I'm just managing my resources. I've reinterpreted the definition of an oppose, community water and oppose, and it turns out it's actually an oppose, my water and oppose. And since it was such a liability for me to fish in it, I decided the safest thing for everyone was to just take the water away entirely, for the harmony of the neighborhood, end quote. And she looked like she was going to have a stroke right there on my welcome mat, her mouth opening and closing like one of the fish she'd banned me from catching, before she stomped back to her cart and sped off, her tires screeching on the asphalt. The pressure from the rest of the neighborhood was what finally broke them. Because people can handle a lot of things, but they can in oppos. T handled their property values plummeting as the lake they paid a premium for turns into a swamp, and their prize-winning lawns die in the heat. And by the end of the week, I received a hand-delivered package. No stamps, no mailman, just a folder dropped on my porch by Bill, the guy from the board who looked like he hadn't into oppos. T slept in days, and inside was a formal rescission of the fine, a written apology signed by every member of the board, and a proposed, in quote, water rights agreement, in quote, that offered to pay me a monthly maintenance fee to keep the sluice gates open, a fee that was, ironically, almost exactly the amount of my new mortgage payment. I didn't in oppos, T sign it right away. I made them wait another 48 hours, just long enough for the mud in the lake bed to start cracking in the sun, before I finally opened the gates and let the water rush back in, watching the fountains at the entrance sputter and roar back to life like a dying man taking his first breath. And that evening, I walked down to the shore, which was still a bit muddy but filling fast, and I cast my line out into the center of the ripples with Cooper sitting right there beside me, tail thumping against the damp ground. I haven in oppos. T received a letter from the HOA in 2 years, and whenever Evelyn drives by in her golf cart, she doesn't in oppos. T look at my grass. She doesn't in oppos. T look at my mailbox. She just stares straight ahead like I don in oppos. T exist, which is exactly how I like it, but it makes you wonder, doesn't in oppos. T it about the people we give power to over our own homes. The little dictators in suburban polo shirts who think they can decide how you live your life just because they have a title and a gavel. And it makes me wonder how many other people are sitting out there right now, staring at a ridiculous fine or a stupid rule, feeling like they have no choice but to bow down and pay up. So I'm curious, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have written the check just to keep the peace? Or would you have gone to war for the principle of the thing? And do you think I went too far by drying up the whole neighborhood just to prove a point? Or was it the only way to make them? Listen to a guy who just wanted to catch a fish. Let me know in the comments, because I've got a feeling I'm not the only one who's had to buy the dam just to save the lake.